Clarence Raby shared many similarities with the other residents of Raccoon Valley, a secluded and distant region where Union and Knox counties met in Tennessee. This location was completely disconnected from the urban environment of nearby Knoxville. One could argue that the inhabitants of this rugged terrain were as wild and untamed as the creatures that wandered through it. Growing up in these conditions, Clarence became an unruly youth who dedicated his time to hunting expeditions, fishing trips, and exploring the extensive cave systems and untamed wilderness that characterized Raccoon Valley. While his father worked as an ordinary farmer, his mother stayed home and adored Clarence with intense devotion. Being her youngest son, Clarence was incapable of wrongdoing in his mother's perception. When he took money from the church collection plate, his mother insisted he was merely attempting to break a larger bill, and at age 15, when Clarence grabbed a woman's handbag and fled, she claimed this too wasn't really his responsibility. She argued that most of the blame belonged to his older sibling Joe's negative influence. His elder brother constantly found himself in various kinds of trouble, and young Clarence simply happened to be present during these minor criminal activities, according to his devoted mother's account. However, the reality was quite different. Clarence was carefully mimicking Joe's footsteps exactly, and he would eventually surpass his brother to establish himself as among the most infamous criminals in eastern Tennessee's chronicles. The two brothers devoted far more hours to wilderness activities with their hunting dogs than to classroom education, occasionally spending entire weeks camping with nothing but a firearm for supplies. Though their academic skills in literacy and mathematics were severely lacking, they possessed intimate knowledge of rye plant species, tree variety, and wildlife tracks throughout the forest, and they felt equally comfortable in the isolated mountains as other children felt on a school playground. There's an ancient proverb suggesting that inactive minds become fertile ground for evil, and this appeared accurate for both Clarence and Joe. The pair eventually abandoned their formal education and began engaging in various juvenile offenses, initially taking bicycles and equipment before progressing to burglarizing residences during working hours. However, Clarence's initial encounter with law enforcement occurred at age 15 following the purse-snatching incident, and similar to numerous first-time criminals, he received minimal punishment, merely a probationary sentence lasting 2 years. The budding criminal paid little attention to the magistrate's counsel about reforming his behavior. Upon reaching 18 years of age, Clarence acquired his initial automobile, and the siblings started traveling into the Knoxville region where they executed numerous fraudulent document crimes and burglaries, taking valuable items and selling them at pawn shops. Despite this, law enforcement struggled to connect either brother to these criminal acts. While Joe displayed audacity and took risks, Clarence employed stealth and patience, surveilling locations for extended periods, while learning behavioral patterns and precise schedules of occupants. He observed his targets with the same careful attention he would use tracking forest animals, and he consistently avoided capture. The brothers grew increasingly daring and eventually targeted commercial establishments. In 1955, at 25 years old, Clarence had evolved into a skilled burglar while maintaining an unblemished criminal history. His courage had grown considerably, and he started executing a series of serious crimes. His first major offense involved robbing a Norris, Tennessee fuel station, which led to his arrest. But the closely connected community members of Raccoon Valley provided support for his defense, with multiple witnesses, including his mother, claiming during legal proceedings that Clarence had been home when the robbery occurred, resulting in his acquittal. Feeling encouraged by this outcome, the siblings embarked on a criminal streak, initially burglarizing an elementary school's lunchroom and stealing provisions, followed by breaking into a residence where they took 3 shotguns, 1 rifle, 11 ammunition containers, and various pieces of jewelry. That same evening, they forced entry into a carpentry workshop and stole the security box. During the process of loading it into their vehicle, law enforcement noticed the criminals and initiated pursuit. However, the Knoxville officers lacked familiarity with the unpaved mountain routes that Clarence navigated, and eventually the police became so disoriented they couldn't navigate their way back from Raccoon Valley. The following morning, Clarence's abandoned vehicle was discovered containing the forced open safe. A complete unit of officers and tracking dogs searched the mountainous terrain for 3 full days without locating the Raby brothers. Nevertheless, the authorities understood the fugitives would inevitably appear at their mother's residence seeking a homemade meal, so they maintained surveillance for approximately a month before finally apprehending both Clarence and Joe. The stolen firearms remained concealed, having been hidden in cave systems for what Clarence subsequently described as later purposes. And subsequently, both criminals received burglary convictions and 3-year sentences at Brushy Mountain Prison in Morgan County, Tennessee, known as the southern equivalent of Alcatraz. Brushy Mountain Penitentiary had a reputation as the ultimate destination for America's most dangerous criminals throughout history, including James Earl Ray, the assassin of Martin Luther King. In subsequent years, during the production of Silence of the Lambs, the character Hannibal Lecter was supposedly being transported to Brushy Mountain before his escape. Clearly, Brushy Mountain housed extremely dangerous individuals who now shared living quarters with the Raby brothers. Although prisons theoretically serve as rehabilitation centers according to official documentation, the truth was that facilities like Brushy Mountain essentially functioned as advanced training programs for aspiring criminals. Within these walls, inmates studied the techniques of theft, abduction, and homicide. Brushy's prisoners endured exhausting manual labor in Tennessee's state-run coal mining operations, and Clarence rapidly determined he had no interest in providing unpaid work services. The manner in which the Raby brothers conducted themselves within the prison facility gained them admiration from fellow inmates, and eventually, they collaborated on an intricate escape strategy. Both Clarence and Joe were assigned kitchen duties during evening meals following their daytime coal mining shifts. They understood that the last convoy of coal-hauling vehicles departed immediately after the drivers finished eating, coinciding with the departure of the vehicle removing kitchen waste. Therefore, on that particular evening, while inmates were loading refuse into the vehicles, they placed one waste container holding Joe into a coal transport truck and another container holding Clarence into the garbage truck. In the simple manner, both escaped through the prison entrance, and after traveling several miles, they emerged from the trucks and became fugitives. Within the prison, security personnel discovered the escape, and Brushy Mountain's renowned tracking hounds quickly began pursuing the criminals. Around midnight, the dogs detected a powerful scent trail of the siblings and came so near that the fugitives could observe the guards' flashlight beams through the vegetation, prompting the brothers to separate. Clarence possessed exceptional running abilities, and he quickly outdistanced the pursuing guards, and by sunrise he had completely vanished. Most puzzling of all, the guards were baffled about how the canines lost all detectable traces of both individuals. However, they were unaware that both fugitives had applied turpentine extracted from pine tree resin to their footwear and hosiery, preventing the dogs from following their scent. By this stage, capturing these wilderness-adapted individuals wouldn't be simple, but the isolated mountains encircling Brushy were harsh and inhabited by every dangerous creature that continued to roam the wilderness. After several days passed, Joe surrendered himself, and several weeks afterward, Clarence did likewise. They returned to Brushy Mountain Penitentiary, where they would stay until both received parole following 2 years of their 3-year terms. Upon release from confinement, Brushy Mountain had successfully reformed Joe, and he abandoned his criminal lifestyle as a changed individual. However, Clarence took a different path. He immediately resumed his previous criminal activities, and he made a commitment to never return to prison. By May 1960, Clarence had devoted almost his entire 28 years of existence to criminal pursuits, though he had occasionally worked as someone who digs wells, but whenever he received payment, he wasted his earnings seeking solace in whiskey. By June, authorities arrested him once more for operating a vehicle while intoxicated, which constituted a parole violation and resulted in a 90-day detention in Knoxville. However, Clarence understood the prison system thoroughly from both perspectives, and he skillfully manipulated the security staff into granting him trustee privileges, which allowed him to participate in external work assignments collecting roadside litter. And merely 30 days into his detention period, Raby and another inmate named McCoy escaped once more. If authorities had any uncertainty regarding how determined Clarence was to stay free, he was prepared to eliminate all such doubts. The initial action the two escapees took was forcing entry into a residence, taking a shotgun and a Pontiac vehicle in an attempt to rapidly flee Knoxville, and by the time they arrived at the small town of Andersonville, the vehicle's fuel was nearly depleted, so they pulled into a service station for refueling. After the vehicle was filled, McCoy shouted to Raby, "Hurry up, let's go, let's get out of here." However, Clarence glanced toward the shop and stated, "I'll be right back." The narrator genuinely believes this represented the critical turning point in Clarence Raby's criminal trajectory. There's a firm conviction that he had already decided to murder the store's operator. Clarence retrieved a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun from the vehicle's rear and proceeded deliberately across the parking area. Within the shop, proprietor Frank Keith observed his approach and attempted to flee toward the rear, but Raby fired through the glass storefront, killing him instantly before calmly walking past the deceased individual and removing $1,000 from the cash drawer. At this instant, a murderer emerged. Law enforcement rapidly connected the two men's escape, the stolen vehicle, and subsequently the homicide, determining that Raby and McCoy were the probable perpetrators, and the FBI promptly issued arrest warrants for the highway criminals. By the next morning, officers discovered the stolen automobile had been set ablaze beside the road in Raccoon Valley, but the criminals had vanished, having obtained another vehicle and traveled to North Carolina. Upon arriving there, the two criminals parted ways. Clarence retained all the stolen funds except $20, which he provided to McCoy for bus transportation to Chicago. Beginning at this point, each man acted independently, and neither individual would surface again for an entire month. Every law enforcement organization in eastern Tennessee was searching for Clarence. They anticipated the mother-attached criminal would ultimately return to his home territory. The fugitive moved between stolen automobiles that he would retain for merely several days before abandoning them and obtaining replacements. He passed his evenings resting in the mountainous regions before ultimately returning to Union County, Tennessee on August 1st, where he immediately detained an entire household in their residence while stealing $135, a .357 Magnum handgun, 2 shotguns, and their Buick, and their Chevrolet, and their Ford, and their Dodge, and their truck, and their car. The subsequent day, Clarence was driving along Highway 61 beyond Big Ridge State Park when an off-duty Union County law enforcement officer spotted him. The officer immediately reversed direction and pursued the fugitive for 3 miles along the winding mountain highway at velocities approaching 100 miles per hour. Clarence successfully created distance from the pursuing lawman, but the criminal lost vehicle control and crashed, completely obstructing the roadway. Immediately after Raby extracted himself from the damaged vehicle, he noticed an elderly gentleman seated in a rocking chair on his front porch opposite the street. "Son, do you need a chain?" the unfamiliar person inquired. "Why, that's mighty nice of you to offer." "I sure do," Raby responded. However, while the senior citizen opened his storage building to retrieve the chain, he experienced the frigid metal of the .357 Magnum touching the rear of his skull. "Give me your keys to your truck, old man." Following this, he compelled the fragile elderly man to accompany him in the vehicle. While Raby operated the vehicle up the driveway returning toward the roadway and the accident scene, he locked eyes with the deputy standing in the street. The moment the patrolman recognized the fugitive, he withdrew his service firearm and began shooting, creating 3 holes in the stolen vehicle. But while Raby accelerated away, he discharged 3 rounds of his own, striking the deputy in the facial area, abandoning him, deceased, in the center of the roadway. Several miles farther along the route, the police killer freed the elderly gentleman without causing harm and vanished. However, he understood he needed to abandon the vehicle, so several miles afterward he entered a roadside tavern's parking area where a couple was preparing to depart in their automobile. Raby positioned the vehicle beside them and simply entered the vehicle's rear compartment with them and instructed the male to begin operating the vehicle. His spouse yelled, "Get the hell out of our car," and consequently received a severe pistol beating from the criminal. After several minutes passed, Clarence Raby compelled the male to halt the automobile, where he abandoned the married pair beside the roadway and continued onward, heading toward the isolated mountainous regions where he had spent his childhood and which he knew intimately, Raccoon Valley, with his intentions focused on a conclusive confrontation with whoever possessed sufficient courage to attempt stopping him. Reports of the criminal activities and dual homicide horrified the entire country, with the narrative appearing on primary newspaper pages as distant as New York and Los Angeles. The FBI immediately positioned the criminal at the pinnacle of their 10 most wanted criminals roster and dispatched numerous agents to eastern Tennessee to locate the murderer. Clarence Raby had now become the nation's primary public threat. 4 law enforcement organizations, including the Tennessee Highway Patrol, the TBI, and the FBI, explored the mountainous terrain and underground cave networks of Raccoon Valley. Equipped with tracking hounds and aerial vehicles, security checkpoints were established throughout the region, but Raby remained undetected. Law enforcement was certain that the mountain residents of the territory were providing concealment for the criminal, and they provided absolutely no cooperation, due to their complete absence of confidence in any law enforcement personnel. It was evident that in numerous respects, the authorities had no plans to capture the killer alive. Their objective was pursuing retribution, reciprocal justice. Within days of the search beginning, a parent and offspring duo from neighboring Oak Ridge participated in the search when Knox County Sheriff's Department personnel, in what appeared to be a case of incorrect identification, discharged firearms at both individuals, hitting the offspring 3 times, resulting in his death, and striking the parent twice, causing potentially fatal wounds. This incident revealed the corrupt network of Southern law enforcement officers. Multiple deputies fabricated a complete falsehood, claiming that the parent and offspring had initiated gunfire toward the officers first, but personnel from alternative law enforcement organizations had observed the incident and provided contradictory accounts. Suddenly, during Tennessee's Mrs. Ost extensive manhunt, the officers themselves faced FBI investigation. For 3 complete weeks, Raby avoided 100 law enforcement officers and tracking hounds, and the narrator doubts they would have ever apprehended him, but he ultimately became exhausted from concealment. While law enforcement was distributed throughout the mountains, Clarence simply returned to his residence undetected, cleaned himself, and his mother prepared him a hot dinner before he surrendered to authorities. Officers were cognizant of his previous Brushy Mountain Prison escape and were apprehensive about detaining him in the Clinton facility, so they confined him in Knoxville awaiting legal proceedings where he confronted execution by electrocution. Throughout the entire month Clarence remained incarcerated. His devoted mother would deliver him a homemade dinner daily. It appeared that Clarence was prepared to accept responsibility for his criminal actions, and he started confessing to multiple unresolved homicides and armed thefts that law enforcement had been unable to attribute. Subsequently, on October 24, 1960, following 4 weeks of incarceration, Raby requested the jailer's presence again. Apparently, he had another criminal act he intended to confess. Multiple officers rapidly transported the criminal to the questioning chamber to document his admission, and upon completion, they escorted him back to his confinement space on the 4th level. However, upon opening his confinement space to return Raby inside, Clarence withdrew a .357 Magnum handgun from his trousers and captured all 4 officers as hostages. "I'm not going to the electric chair for no body, and I'll put a hole in the back of your head if I need to, but boys, I'll be leaving this jail now." Apparently, his devoted elderly mother had delivered Clarence something additional beyond cornbread that particular day. Clarence compelled all 4 individuals onto the lift, where he insisted on obtaining police vehicle access keys and confiscated their firearms. The cunning criminal had succeeded once more and was preparing to simply exit the detention facility. However, upon the lift entrance opening on the ground level, the complete corridor contained 30 law enforcement officers. The explanation was that it was 10 p.m. during personnel rotation. However, the criminal remained undeterred. He rapidly captured a deputy as hostage with a firearm against his skull and started discharging projectiles into the gathering of officers in the confined corridor. Pandemonium erupted, and individuals sought protection, concealing themselves in storage spaces. During this period, the procedure for personnel rotation prohibited officers from carrying firearms, so the law enforcement personnel lacked even a firearm for self-protection. Clarence progressed along the corridor, approaching the departure point where liberty awaited beyond the entrance. At that moment, he moved past the dispatcher's workspace and discharged a projectile through the glass barrier. Within the space, an officer possessed a sidearm and elevated it to prevent the escape effort. But Clarence discharged first, striking the deputy twice in the abdomen, and while the officer collapsed to the surface, he discharged his revolver completely, hitting Clarence 3 times in the dorsal area precisely as he arrived at the departure point. Gravely injured, Clarence forced the entrance open and attempted to reach freedom, collapsing on the courthouse grounds, deceased. Share your thoughts about Clarence in the comments section, and remember to like and subscribe for additional authentic narratives from Appalachia's history.